Good morning and welcome back to Spitch YouTube. About a year ago, I got incredibly addicted to Balatro. I'd fallen ill with naught to do, and I'd wanted to play Balatro for months at that point. It was a recipe for addiction. It was also an incredibly fun time, one of my favourite gaming addictions I've had. I got Completionist++ about 5 to 6 months later, and for the past 8 months or so, I've been working on and off on this video. I remember during that initial half year having so much I wanted to say about the game, but uni took up a lot of my time recently, and I found my thoughts on the game kept changing throughout the last few months anyway. This script is a hodgepodge of different opinions I've had over the last year on this game. I've moved the chapters and rewritten some sections every couple of months, but I'm finally happy to share some thoughts on Balatro. I hope you enjoy it. We'll start with some more basic thoughts and drill much deeper by the third chapter. Thought number 1, Peripheral Gamemodes. Balatro's main game feels really good. By main game, I'm just referring to white stakes up to ante 8. This is like the bare minimum the game really had to do. Things like stakes, endless mode, and challenges are all peripheral aspects that, while pretty common in a lot of roguelikes, definitely aren't necessary for the game to have a satisfying internal loop. But those peripheries are done incredibly well in Balatro, especially in comparison to its peers, so I wanted to spend a bit of time reflecting on those peripheral game modes. Let's start with endless mode. I think out of every roguelike I've ever played, Balatro's got the single best endless mode. In fact, I think there's only one other roguelike whose endless mode I willingly interact with consistently, which is Nuclear Throne. I'm a bit biased in this. I think I'm, generally speaking, an endless mode hater. I like feeling like there's a single goal you're trying to achieve with your run and feeling like that goal is blatantly defined in the game's design and presentation. I just enjoy having an obvious goal I'm working to improve my perfection of. I also think it leads to balance being reasonably focused on that goal, and if a game is balanced around a specific commonplace goal, I think it makes for a more enjoyable game. Nonetheless, for the first month or so of playing Balatro, I probably put like 90% of my runs into endless mode, which was such a deviation from any other roguelike for me. I stopped doing that after a while because, as I mentioned, I'm generally speaking an endless mode hater, as well as I found ante 8 to be a really satisfying conclusion, especially as you're increasing in stakes. But to have partaken so frequently in it when I rarely do so in other games really made me think about why it doesn't even cross my mind to do so in other roguelikes. So what does Balatro do well? I think most prominently is the scaling. The scaling is sharp and direct, which I think is really quite necessary. Each subsequent ante after 8 is a genuinely impactful increase. A run that overkills ante 8 without any concern won't necessarily be the same one to overkill ante 10, or even be close to beating 12 or 14. This hasn't been my experience with other roguelike continue playing your run modes. I think Isaac is the pinnacle of a poorly implemented continue the game after the game mechanic. If we ignore the fact that you can only even do a victory lap after defeating a specific boss, which circumstantially is the least likely boss you'll be looking to fight, how a victory lap plays is kind of awkward. You just go back to the first floor with the same difficulty and rewards that the first floor normally has. The game doesn't get any harder when you want to play more of it. Instead, it gets easier. For quite a while, in fact. Imagine if in Balatro, after you beat ante 8 and hit endless mode, ante 9 was back to just needing to score 300 chips against the small blind, just like in ante 1. Now, this isn't a truly fair comparison, as you can tell by the name Victory Lap. The point of Isaac's run continuation feature isn't to maintain or increase the difficulty, but instead to be permitted to continue having the fun of whatever build you've been given. You'll only see the given synergy of items you've been granted every so often. And if you're the kind of player who really enjoys the power fantasy of feeling overpowered or of a specific synergy, then the Victory Lap feature is intended for you. It's a bit strange that it then gets rid of a percentage of your items for the second Victory Lap, and that to access Victory Laps you need to have chosen to pick up an item halfway through the game before you possibly decide you enjoy your run enough to even want to do a Victory Lap, but I digress. Balatro managed to accomplish that goal of continuing the power fantasy of your run without needing all these hang-ups, which is a massive point in its favour. And again, I realise I'm not really the target audience for Isaac's Victory Lap feature. For me, what I found that I want most out of gaming experiences is to feel like I'm overcoming a struggle, and through skill, strategy, intellect, reason, or whatever other trait, I'm coming out on top. And Isaac's Victory Laps don't really accomplish that. Yeah, after 3 laps it eventually turns you into the Lost, which is just an incredibly absurd jump in risk. But I don't think it's crazy to say that the Victory Lap system isn't particularly enjoyable. Other games have continued playing your run modes that are slightly better than Isaac. Risk of Rain is a pretty good example. It does the same thing as Isaac with sending you back to the start, but the enemies scale their difficulty pretty reasonably and continue to do so with every loop. In addition, in the second Risk of Rain, there are quite difficult unique buffs that enemies can have a bit into the loops as well, which act as a solid spike in difficulty that you need to be able to overcome. Balatro and Risk of Rain 2 are aligned in that the testing is meaningful in their endless modes, that there's impactful scaling or questions that feel satisfying to beat. It's worth mentioning here that Balatro is lucky in that it's a lot easier for a game like Balatro to have an endless mode fit into its design. Number go up at a certain rate is a lot simpler to implement and fine-tune, I assume, than coding and designing whole difficulty systems or room and floor types or unique elites or a whole sub-game mode that an action game like Risk of Rain 2 would need to do. I say this to quickly bring up Isaac again. I don't want to make it seem like I'm out for blood against Isaac. Even though I've been negative towards its looping system, I think this point about the amount of effort to make their mode feel rewarding is a genuine thing to keep in mind. If Edmund or Kilburn or whoever has only X amount of development hours to work on any system, victory laps are not a priority in any way, shape or form. This also isn't to say that Balatro's endless mode is as simple as increase number. I think the detail of a finisher blind every 8 antes is a really neat touch. I mentioned Nuclear Throne earlier when talking about the continue playing your run systems that I do partake in. I'm not really an expert on Nuclear Throne and I don't feel comfortable making broad and sweeping statements about a game I've not got a lot of time in, but I do feel like Nuclear Throne does a similar thing to Balatro. It does feel like the looping is still testing you in a well-defined, reasonable manner. And if you'll forgive me for going slightly off topic for a sec, I think I loop in the Nuclear Thrones and don't in the Risk of Rains for a couple of reasons, despite both being similar in as much as they're action roguelikes. The first reason is that I find that Risk of Rain 2 has a pretty fulfilling crescendo at Mithrix, especially in the soundscape and design, and Risk of Rain 1 is even more fulfilling in that regard. While I don't find Nuclear Throne's normal end feels as good to me. The Risk of Rains are again like Balatro to me in that sense. I feel pretty satisfied and rewarded at the completion of Ante 8. The second is that Nuclear Throne hides a lot of depth in its loops that I don't find Risk of Rain does as much. The Risk of Rain endless modes definitely have a lot of time and thought put into them, but I find there's enough to love about its main game that I don't feel like I need to spend time in its endless mode to get what I want out of Risk of Rain, while I feel like I need to for Nuclear Throne. And third, perhaps the most prominent reason, is that Nuclear Throne is definitely the shortest game of the lot. A Nuclear Throne run doesn't take all that much time, while Risk of Rain run, Isaac run, and Balatro run definitely take on average a fair bit longer. But again, within its peer group, Balatro is on top when it comes to endless modes, at least out of the games I've played. Before I move on, I want to do a little bit of soul reading. During the last couple of minutes when I've been talking about endless modes, was there a specific game you thought I should have mentioned but didn't? There's going to be some of you that thought of this, so maybe I'll look a bit silly to you. And there's going to be some false positives here where you think I'm going to talk about a certain game, but I'm not. But I'm going to wager that the vast majority of you completely forgot that Slay the Spire has an endless mode. I've spoken about Slay the Spire to tons of people in tons of different contexts, and not a single one has ever talked to me about the endless mode, while everyone I've spoken to about Balatro has mentioned Balatro's endless mode. I don't think I've ever thought about Slay the Spire's endless mode outside of seeing a post once every 4 months on the subreddit talking about the Pride Curse. Maybe the soul read won't work on everyone, and Slay the Spire's endless mode has a whole cult built around it that invited all 8 billion people in the world to it but I genuinely haven't heard anyone personally talk to me about the endless mode. I don't have anything major I wanted to say about it, partly because I also haven't played it since it came out. I just wanted to bring it up. Endless mode isn't the only peripheral game mode that I think Balatro does quite well, and since I've just brought up Slay the Spire, let's talk about stakes and ascensions. Just like with endless mode, I think Balatro does ascensions the best out of any roguelike I've ever played. Perhaps I'm a little bit biased again in that it's only one of 2 or 3 roguelikes I've ever gone into enough to do every single level of each ascension on each character fully, but I do think Balatro hit the nail on the head for what to do right with ascensions, and I think it gets it right by having each stake have a genuinely meaningful and fully felt impact. There isn't really a stake that doesn't reframe how you have to strategize and plan about the game. I think you can maybe claim to me that red, green, and purple aren't particularly difficult, especially because they mostly ask you to make sure you're playing your fundamentals well, such as not spending frivolously, but they still absolutely force you to make way less mistakes, increasing the stake of your gameplay. I definitely had this incredibly strong feeling, especially when trudging through blue and orange stake, that the way I was currently playing simply wasn't good enough, and that I needed to actively learn something that would improve my gameplay. Often this had to do with Joker, Voucher, or Booster Pack evaluations, and I think this is really rewarding. It makes it so that when you complete a given stake, you really feel like you improve your gameplay by a considerable margin. At least it felt like that to me. Each stake felt like a meaningful jump in difficulty and a meaningful jump in my own skill, which is perhaps the greatest dopamine hit you can give a strategy and competitively brain-rotted player like myself. I say this in stark comparison to how I felt about Slay the Spire's Ascensions. 20 Ascensions is a completely different feeling to 8 stakes. There are some Ascensions in Slay the Spire where it's barely noticeable that anything different has changed. You really have to take the Ascensions in groups of 3 to 5 if you want to present a particularly noticeable difference, and I'd wager that some single stakes in Balatro still feel more impactful and require more improvements in gameplay than some 5 sets in Slay the Spire. And again, this isn't like an issue of game design or anything. There's tons of things that Slay the Spire's Ascension does well, like the theming of the thing. You get this feeling in Slay the Spire with the Ascensions that you're climbing up a tower and just having a little bit more difficulty than the last time, rather than these massive strides or jumps. And I think Slay the Spire leans into that feeling quite well. I'm mostly just trying to express how I felt about it, and I personally think I meshed with the Balatro stake system in an incredibly rewarding way, more than I felt with any Ascension system in the past. There's a couple other roguelikes I've played with Ascension systems. One Step, which has a looping mechanic I didn't mention earlier, Luck Be a Landlord, which also has a continue feature, and Monster Train all have Ascensions, which definitely feel closer to how Slay the Spire does it. Although I do want to highlight that One Step has some Ascensions, or hell levels, that feel super unique. Like, one of them is to get rid of the visual aid of knowing which tile is 4 tiles away, which is where most of your hits attack, and I think that's the only time I've played a game with Ascensions where one of the Ascensions didn't make the game mechanically any harder, and just instead removed a simple visual tool. I think that's like a super fun Ascension. I'll quickly put here that yes, Risk of Rain 2 also has an Ascension system in Eclipse mode, which I progressed a little into, but didn't get too far in. Like Balatro, there are 8 Ascensions, and many of the changes do feel meaningful, but Risk of Rain 2 is a little weirder to me, in that the skill of getting better at mechanical inputs and dodging and so forth isn't one I enjoy working on as much as the process of evaluation, like in a card game. They both have skills that are tested harder in their Ascensions, and most of the time each Ascension does feel like a meaningful increase, but I just don't enjoy the process of improving mechanical gameplay as much as mathematical gameplay. I enjoy it a little bit, but not as much. The third and final peripheral game mode are the challenges, and they're fine. I like them, I think they're mostly pretty cool. I think I respect that a lot of them aren't challenging, and are just Jimbo going, hey, what if we gave you these 2 jokers and said they're part of a theme? Wouldn't that be cool? I like that they're almost like silly side stories to the main game. At least the vast majority of the challenges are like that. Most don't impact gameplay too much, and can be ignored or played into for a fun little power fantasy. There's about 3 of them that are a little bit tough, Golden Needle, Cruelty, and Jokerless, but they're also a pretty fun experience. They're not overwhelmingly difficult as to feel frustrating or like Jimbo is actively wasting your time, but are also good as alternate difficult side games that aren't just the increasing stakes. And this is where I compare it to the only other game that I know has a similar feature, which is The Binding of Isaac again. And Isaac, just like Balatro, has the majority of the challenges be mostly just the main game with some starter items. Some are a little harder than the base game, say Cursed for example, but Isaac also has one of the least fun challenges in a game I've ever had the displeasure of interacting with in Ultra Hard. It just kinda sucks. I can talk about how it's poor game design or whatever, and maybe it's not even poor game design. I just think it sucks to play. It's no fun, feels terrible, and completing it only makes you feel good in the sense that you feel like it's finally over, rather than feeling like you've discovered something enlightening about the game, unlike what I think Jokerless, Cruelty, and Golden Needle do. There's another major difference between Isaac and Balatro's relationship with challenges, which is that in Isaac, each challenge unlocks something. A new item that can appear in runs, or something for a character to start with. Balatro doesn't reward you with anything from challenges, other than filling up the challenges completed bar and putting a tick next to the ones you've done. I like Balatro's unlock system, and we'll talk about that more in a sec, so I'm definitely satisfied with the fact that Balatro challenges don't unlock anything. But I think it's a bit un-Balatro-liked that the only reward for challenges is filling up the completionist bar and getting a tick next to the challenges. Balatro is normally really good at giving you a silly little aesthetic trophy for doing something, like the stickers on the decks and jokers for completing certain stakes. And I'd really love it if something like that existed for completing all the challenges. Maybe like a thing on the Balatro and the title screen or something like that. Those are the peripheral game modes that Balatro has. Endless mode, stakes, and challenges, which I find are all done very well. There's only one peripheral mode that a lot of other games have that Balatro doesn't have, which is the daily run. I've always had a weird mental block about daily challenges in games. For some reason, even though it's just a random seed plucked from the endless possibilities, just like when you start a new run, it always feels wrong to me that others are playing the seed and that it's already been discovered. I feel like I'm not discovering the seed, or that the run I'm doing is somehow not as unique as runs in the normal game, and as such I've always distanced myself from daily runs. This is another feature that Slay the Spire has that I don't hear anyone talk about, and it's also another feature that Isaac has, and a feature that Isaac puts unlocks behind for whatever godforsaken reason. I don't think Balatro needs daily runs, and if I had them I probably wouldn't interface with them at all, but it felt wrong for me to mention endless stakes and challenges and not mention the fairly other common peripheral game mode that popular roguelikes often have. But I want to say that overall, Balatro does these peripheral game modes incredibly well. While I don't ever play endless mode anymore, I definitely interfaced with it because I wanted to multiple times, which is more than I can say for a couple of other roguelikes. And again, it's also something that people talk to me about all the time when they're talking about Balatro, and it's a really core aspect of what a lot of people enjoy about the game, and I think that's great, and unlike many other roguelikes. Challenges and stakes are also done really well in Balatro. They feel refined, impactful, fun, and that you're improving at the game when you accomplish them, at least for the stakes in the later 3 challenges. Balatro's core game is really rewarding, but what feels great is that everything built above and around that core game is just as amazing as well. And I'd be remiss if I didn't glaze Balatro a little bit for all of this. Balatro does a lot right, and I think to me this is one of the clearest examples. Thought number 2, unlocks and minigames. I'm gonna get a bit abstract here, possibly unnecessarily, but bear with me. One way to think about the peripheral game modes I mentioned before is to think of them as sort of meta-structures or metagames that exist above the regular structure of the game. Not only when you're playing like a game or round of Balatro are you making decisions within the game for the purpose of trying to win that individual game, but you're often trying to complete something outside of that game. Perhaps progressing a stake, or beating your high score, or finding a Joker setup you've never found before, something like that. One such meta-structure like this is unlocking things. While the vast majority of unlocks in Balatro will occur naturally, such as playing or discarding a ton of cards, there's a fair couple that you're more likely to complete by active intention rather than circumstantially. This isn't something that takes up a lot of your time in Balatro. Frankly, I nearly wrote this whole script without remembering there were even unlocks in the game, because for the vast majority of my playtime, I had all the Jokers and vouchers unlocked. But it is a mechanic that you interact with during your time with Balatro. As I mentioned before, I think I'm pretty happy with how Balatro does unlocks. I appreciate that Balatro as a game overall is relatively content light, as in it has fewer items rather than many items, and that you'll likely unlock all the unlocks before you get overly deep into the game. Spire does a very similar thing. You get access to like all the content extremely early in both Slay the Spire and Balatro. Not every roguelike is like that, obviously. As per usual, the complete other end of the coin is Isaac, where for most players the point of each run is to unlock a new bit of content. The reason you're playing the given character you're playing and taking the path you're taking is to do a completionist activity that comes with an unlock. This isn't to say Balatro doesn't also have this completionist sensibility. I'm sure a lot of players, myself included, played with the goal of beating a new stake with a deck each time you played, but there's basically no relationship between winning a run and getting a correlated unlock. And before you get persnickety, yeah, some decks are gated by stakes, but that's incredibly minor compared to how it's done in Isaac. Another method for unlock systems I've seen a few games do is have a meta currency that you spend on unlocking things. Gungeon and Wizard of Legend both do this, and I've always felt a little bit weird about them. As I mentioned in some thoughts on One Step from Eden, having the easy capacity to manipulate what things are included in the pool or not is something I always feel weird about, and being able to elect what items are included in the game with a meta currency gives me a very similar feeling. What Balatro does for some of these unlocks are these metagame-based weird challenges, like playing for 7 of clubs or discarding a royal flush. This isn't unique to Balatro, obviously. Isaac also has a ton of these, and the Risk of Rains do a very similar thing. I like challenges like these that present structures which exist above the game that you kind of go out of your way to accomplish, but also don't totally derail your experience with the game as a whole. These sort of act as mini-games within the game of Balatro, where you accomplish a certain thing in a weird way just because you sort of can. I think Balatro hits the right balance of having some unlocks you need to go out of your way for, without feeling like hours of your time is dedicated to crafting Zodia just so you can unlock the banner Joker. So I like the way Balatro does unlocks. I think it's well done and hits the right balance of being a fun thing to think about during your early Balatro experiences, but aren't too forceful or frustrating. Yo, so this is now November 2025 Spids YouTube, as opposed to May 2025 Spids YouTube. This thought initially had 2 parts, this section about unlocks and then another section about another way to view minigames. It's the section I've changed my opinion the most on over the past year, and frankly, I'm still unsure how to think about it. So I'm going to give you an overhead of what I had planned to say, or what May 2025 Spids YouTube did in fact say, where my disagreement comes from, and then unfortunately kind of leave it unresolved. The basic premise I had for the next section was simple. There are these funny mini-games in Balatro within the context of each blind that don't contribute directly to scoring the current blind but give you some sort of benefit. Gold cards and mail and rebate being the obvious ones, but there's tons of examples. I was also including scaling jokers such as Castle and Wii, and deck manipulation jokers like DNA and Trading Card. I then make the claim that I've really struggled to decide if I still agree with, which was, I find that Balatro has very few mini-games that come with a particularly evocative power fantasy associated with it. I then spend the rest of the next 8 minutes discussing what I mean by this statement and try and give some examples of what I'd be looking for by a particularly evocative power fantasy that isn't fulfilled by Balatro. And it's given with the context of an update coming out. I then tried to argue this point to 2 separate friends of mine, both of whom either casually or competitively disagreed. I'd say things like the pawn from the Bunko mod, the most seamlessly vanilla of all the mods, is a really unique way to have a minigame related to deck manipulation, and this type of power fantasy doesn't exist in Balatro. And yeah, that specific power fantasy doesn't, but the game has stuff like Cania and Tribble, which I think very reasonably could be said to have minigames with fairly evocative power fantasies. And so does Space Joker, or Dice and Lucky cards, or Vagabond, or Vampire. And I got to the point where I felt like I was saying, besides these 20 examples, Balatro doesn't have X, which when you get to that high of an example count in a game with 150 Jokers, makes it feel like a really silly argument, which maybe it is. Yet, nonetheless, I still feel as if there is very little in the way of an overall divergent gameplay experience, where your minigames don't feel like it's a simplistic choice for for a simplistic benefit, like X-Malt or currency because you discarded before you played a hand or something. And even examples like Vampire or Vagabonds feel like slightly different flavors of the same idea. To win a game, all you need is the chips, plus malt and X-Malt answer, and you achieve value through some money-making or deck manipulation jokers that don't require you to do that much. Now, to be fair, Balatro doesn't have a lot of variables to manipulate. Like, what else are you changing with these newer gameplay patterns besides discards, hands, cards in hand, chips, plus malt, times malt, and currency? One suggestion that I gave was a slightly different relationship to tempo, trying to suggest jokers that are actively bad early that have a sudden jump to greatness. But then, like, this is one step removed from a scaling joker, which Balatro has in spades, or rather in Ride the Bus, among others. So I don't really know how to articulate what it is that I want. What is the thing that I feel like Balatro doesn't have? It's some nebulous concept between the way you interface with your power fantasy that I feel like doesn't exist. But I can't explain what that is and then justify it. I want to say I believe the statement that Balatro has too simple of relationships with tempo as an overall concept, but then any idea I think to change that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, so I'm stuck. And that's it. Now, it'll stay unresolved. This version of this section is much shorter than the old version, but I really hope this dialogue suffices for trying to make a clarification on this. And let's move on. Or rather, let's move back to hearing myself from 6 months ago talk about thought number 3, balance in the shop. Originally, I was planning a whole diatribe about balance when it comes to gaming in general, particularly on what the point of discussing balance is supposed to be. It ended up being like 15 minutes, and I spent most of my time talking about every game imaginable besides Balatro. The fundamental argument I was arguing for was something like balance by itself is a meaningless metric. It needs to be understood wholly in its relationship to gameplay fantasy and user experience, which I find gets ignored in discussions of balance, and instead balance gets treated as a goal on its own merits. Personally, I believe balance is really just an easy to grasp concept of a much more complicated idea of trying to make the user experience more fun. Keeping that in mind, I want to talk about how well Balatro was balanced, in as much as it can be understood in its relationship between the quality of items and its impact on decision making, how it feels deep and well designed, and relate that to how the shop works. Balance is an awkward term because there are sort of two ways people interpret it. One is every item equally justifiable? Are they all equally strong? And one is the game consistently interesting? There's definitely correlated questions in that if there's an insanely obvious binary between good items and bad items, then the answer to both questions will be no. Balatro definitely hits the right stride of having the second question be yes though. Despite some jokers or tarot cards or planets being stronger than others, at each choice point there are nearly always interesting decisions that allow you to be both skill expressive and play for your own desires, despite a strength inequality. I doubt there are any games where the first question of is every choice equally strong yes for what it's worth, unless you're playing paper, scissors, rock. To be a complicated, fun, interesting game is often to be a game with too many variables to have all of your archetypes and elements be reducible to something genuinely 50-50 in every instance, nor would that even be necessarily a fun goal. Balatro is jam-packed full of interesting, nuanced, and difficult decisions that feel fun and exciting, despite unbalance in the sense of 8-Ball, for all intents and purposes, is worse than Constellation, or The Lovers in the vast majority of use cases is worse than Hungmen. And I think, in part, what makes Balatro so interesting to me is that it accomplishes this feat via an omnipresent shop. It took me a while to appreciate Balatro's shop in comparison to other roguelikes. The shop fits so well with everything Balatro, thematically and in the determination of a run, that it wasn't even cognitively comparable to shops in other roguelikes. Because it isn't. The shop in Balatro is the main and really only interface when it comes to interacting with run-defining elements. In other roguelikes, there are so many different places that give you the things that define your run. Treasure rooms, or boss rooms, or shops, or events. In Balatro, it is entirely done within the shop. If it's done outside of the shop, it's because you've picked up an item in the shop. I'm ignoring tags for this, but yes, persnickety viewer, tags are an out-of-shop influence. Balatro is the only roguelike I've gotten into that uses a shop, or any equivalent of this single menu influences all macro-level decision-making thing in the way Balatro does. Monster Train is somewhat close, in that there's a stop-starty separation between playing the game and interfacing with the macro decisions, but there's still a very stark difference. All of the decisions in Balatro are made in consideration with money, while in most games, money is only relevant for like one of many different decision-making areas. Like, think about how money interacts with the average Slay the Spire run. You maybe visit a shop 3 to 4 times, 2 of which are probably through question marks. You're more often than not buying a card removal from it, maybe a synergistic card or two. Sometimes if you're rich, often because of a specific event you took with the knowledge that you're going to use that money for a shop, you'll take a relic. I'm cognizant that in higher level Slay the Spire play, like those who attempt to get consistent wins on A20, that potions and recognizing pathing with shops, potions, and elites in mind is more prevalent, but I think for the average Slay the Spire player, this is pretty much how it goes. The only other instances where money is relevant is during events, which, to Slay the Spire's credit, money is actually pretty commonly interacted with during events, especially for exchanging money for a card removal or potions or a relic. But that's all money is used for. Some 4 shops and some 10 events in your 50-odd floor run. Balatro, conversely, gives you a shop 23 times in your 24 floor run. Isaac obviously has a similar relationship with gold. Some characters and items play with gold a little, but it's mostly just for shops. Risk of Rain uses money as the only way to interface with strength increasing, but it's really mindless. It's just a numerical conversion to roll for a chance for something. Eden uses credits in the same way as Slay the Spire, with the exception that there's not really events in the same way as Eden, and like Isaac, some characters or cards have their strength scale with it. You can really fill in the blanks yourself for Hades, FTL, Gungeon, Legend of Bumbo, or whatever other roguelike you're thinking of. The majority of the time, gold or money or whatever currency is treated as a sort of side story in the journey of interfacing with the strength increasing mechanics of the run. Always there, always a consideration, but often only relevant in short bursts throughout the game, and most of the strength comes from one of 3 card reward screens, or moneyless events, or treasure rooms, or whatever. Balatro does the opposite. Money is a single metric that determines the quality of your future possibilities. Since Balatro is purely planning based and not an action game, in the sense that you can't simply win with nothing like you could in an action game, you also need to be constantly evaluating your relationship to money in every instance. All the methods of gridding out value are more often than not about getting money through things like mail-in rebate or things you would otherwise be spending money on like planet cards. None of these game designs are better than one another. It's not like Balatro did the right game design choice and Slay the Spire the wrong one regarding their relationship to money and strength increasing or anything, but they are starkly different and play quite differently, at least I feel so. In Slay the Spire and all these other games, gold feels like a sort of afterthought to your gameplay. It gets compacted as a resource that's relevant infrequently and somewhat present in your mind, but often just as one of a couple of factors in your main thought pattern, which is typically focused on specific cards or relics you're seeking to try and beat the run with. You're mostly thinking about priorities with respect to pick one of 3 screens, or health evaluation, or general risk assessments and math pathing. These mental tasks take up most of your time. Balatro still has the thinking about what high priority elements you're seeking. Are you seeking specific scoring jokers, like an X-Malt joker to square out your build? Are you looking at specific seals or specific tarots or so forth? But it's only understandable under the guise of where you can reasonably spend your money. If you have $16 to your name, priorities are understood with respect to money and nothing else. Do you wish to forego interest for a high priority target? Do you need to take a risk? What are the benefits of opening up an Arcana pack? All of these questions are understood in their relationship to money. In Slay the Spire, making a decision about whether you should add a card to your deck after a regular encounter doesn't impact your capacity to add a card at the next shop, but in Balatro, it does. The equivalent of the pick one of 3 screens that Slay the Spire and every other game has, in Balatro is inherently linked to your money. I like this about Balatro quite a bit, actually. On one hand, I suppose you could argue it feels like Balatro is pretty straightforward, in as much as there aren't any floating currencies for surprise shops in the Slay the Spire sense every few antes. You just have a single flat resource in currency, some relics you can exchange for any time in jokers, a deck which starts out extremely large and primarily gets thinned rather than thickened, compared to most deck building roguelikes which are the opposite, and then permanent upgrades in planet cards. There's no currency that only appears for an infrequent shop. There's no lunar coins, there's no keys and bombs, there's no gemstones or nectar. There's nothing but the single page of the shop. But personally, I find it invigorating to have every decision tied to this solid metric. It makes every decision relate to each other in a way that very few roguelikes seem to do. To pick a joker at low econ is to not feel comfortable picking a voucher. To prioritize econ over scoring is a risk evaluation that is much grander than the currency greeting equivalent in Slay the Spire, such as taking a few extra turns to get Hand of Greed to proc. Balatro is simple in this sense. There's a single number currency that every decision relates to, and there's nothing above it. There's only a single strength increasing interface. But it's also deeper than any single menu in other roguelikes. Everything is understood through money, and I think that's so cool. With all this said about the shop, let's go back to balance. Balatro is balanced in a curious way where every strength increasing mechanic is really just a different function based on what you plan to spend money on. When you're at the shop, every decision is a decision about risk, value, econ, and so forth. And with so many different paths one could take, it feels like every decision is balanced. It's balanced again in the sense that pretty much every decision point feels like a point of skill expression, where it's not that there's one obvious most meaningful choice, but a ton of genuinely good arguments and tough things to have in consideration. If you're overflowing with resources, the balance is found in what specifically to take from the Arcana pack, where there can often be multiple good choices. And if money is scarce, choosing which option to go for, a temporarily good joker or a decent but not great voucher or an Arcana pack or whatever, is super interesting.
I've spoken a lot about a couple of overall different themes, so I want to quickly reduce this argument into as basic premises as possible just so we can sort of conclude this. Firstly, all macro level decisions, like which jokers you want, which hand types to play for, deck fixing, and so forth, is all done in one place, the shop. There aren't any other locations, except like maybe technically tags, to increase strength. Compared to, say, Slay the Spire, where there's card reward screens, and events, and shops, and boss fights, and so forth. Secondly, all decisions in the shop relate to a singular currency, and as such, all decisions relate to other decisions. This is most obvious when money is scarce. Choosing to buy a joker means you have to consider what you're not able to purchase, as well as concepts like scoring, hands to win, since hands are econ as well, interest, and so forth. Again, consider this distinction to a game like Slay the Spire, where choosing from a 1 of 3 card reward screen doesn't impact your currency or anything. And thirdly, Balatro's feeling of balance or feeling of skill expression comes from that experience, being able to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of jokers and tarot cards and so forth with additional respect to the universally present currency. Alright, if we're comfortable with all of this, there's just one more additional element about the shop. Like what I've just said before is already cool as hell, but then there's a goddamn reroll button.
And I really think this puts the bar on top for what makes Balatro's shop so lovely. There's a way to spend money at an extreme rate for a pretty okay benefit, but the benefit is exciting, scaring for specific jokers, or perhaps finding stuff to burn in a campfire, and gives a reason to continue economic prowess to still meaningfully increase strength.
It also fits so thematically in the gambly aesthetic of the game. It really ties everything together so neatly, and it feels balanced too. If you're giving up the comfort of winning for more econ so you can scour for securing more specific jokers with a reroll, that feels like you're making an evaluative decision that comes with risk and upside. So the shop is great. It's such a different way to envision a roguelike, to put all the strength increasing mechanics tied to a single value, and to have the game's minigames and manipulation all focused around maximizing that single value, and to have many different ways of expressing skill through that value, through things that you would choose to spend money on, whether you choose to spend money at all. It's just so great. Ever since I've played Balatro, I'll play games like Slay the Spire and think, man, what the hell is money even doing in this game? It is doing good things, but now it comes across as muted and standard rather than exciting. Money and the way money worked was such a given for roguelikes, I found, and Balatro totally changed my outlook on it.
Thought, or more of a fun fact, number 4, translation. This is going to be less of a thought and more of just a story that I really wanted to include. So I play my games in English. English is my first language, and it's pretty common for developers to be developing primarily in English, at least in the West, and for any non-English game for high quality translations to exist for those games if I end up playing them. But I've also studied a fair few languages, German in primary and high school, Latin for 5 years in high school, and Italian during university. Once or twice I tried playing games in Italian just as a cute exercise to try and practice my understanding and knowledge. So, an Italian friend of mine tried the Italian Balatro translation and has played the game fully in Italian. It's alright, it's about as good a quality as you can get for most games, good in its syntax and lexicon, but it'll miss some things because the translators struggle to match context correctly, and especially for things like the minutiae of abilities can unintentionally rewrite things to be flat out wrong. And sometimes the entire wrong word will be used for, no reason. This happens a few times in the Italian translation, such as seeing double, which says spade, and any non-spade suit. You can look at the joker and see that that's incorrect. There's something super fun that Balatro's Italian translation has though. In English, poker refers to the game of poker. Why? Because we stole the word from France, who seems to have stolen it from Germany, at least according to Wikipedia. I didn't delve into the etymology too deeply. But there's nothing really more than that. The word poker isn't really important for poker. Unlike, say, in Go Fish, where Go Fish is an action you can force the enemy to take during a game of Go Fish. However, in Italian, poker or poker is not just the name of the game, but also the name for one of the kinds of hands, namely 4 of a kind. They don't say the words 4 of a kind, but in Italian they call that hand poker. That's a pretty neat fun fact for trivia night and all that, and when my friend told me that I thought it was pretty cool. They call flush colore and full house full and straight scala, etc. And then I wanted so badly to know what they would call 5 of a kind. If 4 of a kind gets a unique name, what the fuck is 5 of a kind gonna be? But I didn't want to spoil the existence of such a hand to my friend because learning that there are even secret hands in Balatro is one of the coolest early moments of playing the game. So I waited for them to discover it. Now, I love wordplay and puns. Linguistic play has been a big part of my life for my whole life, and I'm studying linguistics in part because of this. And this love is maintained with my exploration into other languages. For example, in Italian, to create a superlative, which is just the most form of something, you add the suffix issim before the agreement in your adjectives. This is the very linguistic way of saying to make a word like big mean the biggest, you turn grande into grandissimo. If you've studied a European language in school, you might be familiar with this sort of morphological change. So, as a joke, whenever I talk to my friend about something being bigger or larger or more, I'll make it a superlative, just as a joke, for completely arbitrary words. Like, oh, if you've beaten Anti-10, that's not merely poggers, that's poggerissimo, or something like that. If there's someone with a big ego, I'll say egoissimo, despite, like, that's not, like, how, like, the language is supposed to work, it's just, like, a pun, basically. And this is mostly funny to just be in him. 5 of a kind is called pokerissimo. And it is perhaps the greatest translation I have ever seen. I could not stop laughing at pokerissimo. It is so beautifully funny to me. And I can't make a video about Balatro and not mention pokerissimo. As you might expect, Flush House is called full colore. Flush 5 is fine. It's called colore perfetto, which is obviously like perfect flush as opposed to like Flush 5, which I think is an adequate translation, but it's so much less exciting to me than pokerissimo. And that's all I wanted to say. Now you know the greatness of the Italian translation, and I kind of wish 5 of a kind was called something sick like that in English as opposed to just like one more than 4 of a kind. But, you know, I guess our saving grace is at least out seeing double says the word clubs on it.
Conclusion. Balatro is peak. I'm pretty vibe spaced when someone asks me what's your favorite game. Often it's just the most recent game I've been super addicted to, and Balatro got that coveted spot basically as soon as I got 2 runs deep. It's since been dethroned by Blueprints, and that 2 will invariably be dethroned. I don't know how, of course, because my current mind tells me that Blueprints is the single greatest game ever made. But not 3 months ago, I believed Balatro to be the single greatest game ever made. And 10-year-old me thought it was either Wizard 101 or Minecraft. Balatro does do a lot right. It feels fluid in so many ways, and it was truly a marvelous time to get into a game that just felt so right. The way it does endless mode and stakes feels exactly right, like a nice meal, and challenges are largely done well as well. And the way the shop and currency plays out as being a coalesced choice point, rather than one of a bunch of different floating currencies and choice points, feels really quite special. That's all I wanted to say on Balatro. See you later, alligators.